50th anniversary, and I encourage you to watch it. Some of it is real good, and some of it, I watched one last night that tried to say that a Secret Service agent shot the president from the limousine in the motorcade. And although they can come up with all kinds of damaging facts, some of this stuff you got to be careful. And I'll start the lecture today by saying, you know, one of the more famous movies about the Kennedy assassination is the movie JFK, which was many years ago, and Kevin Costner starred in it. And it's very dangerous for kids to think that that's what happened if they watch it. That's why I'm glad we teach a class, because Jim Lavelle, a good friend of mine, who was handcuffed to Oswald when he was shot, when he helped Oliver Stone with that movie, he came out and said, you know, there's two things Oliver Stone got right in the movie JFK, the date and the victim. That's all he could come up with. So when you watch some of that, form your own opinions, but there'll be a lot of good stuff out there, and there'll be some crazy stuff too. So we'll kind of go from there. All right, let's review just a little bit. We don't have to review too much on the another Kennedy tragedy. We all know what happened there, that Mrs. Kennedy had a baby that was very premature, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, and he ended up dying in the hospital. We talked about then mending political fences in Texas, and the thing I want you to take out of this is that the president decided he needed to go to Texas because he had some conflict within his own political party, right? He had the conservative wing and the liberal wing arguing it. And Vice President Johnson and Texas Governor John Connally were kind of the conservatives that were giving Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was also a Democrat but a liberal, a bad time. And Johnson was upset at Yarborough because he had supported Kennedy for the Democratic nomination in 1960 rather than himself. And he was good friends with John Connally, and Yarborough had this thing in his mind that those two were trying to unseat him from that Senate seat, and it caused some problems. And Kennedy knew that if he had trouble in the South, especially Texas, because it was a lot of electoral votes, and he saw this as a very close election, that he thought that was really going to hurt his chances to be reelected. And so he planned the trip to Texas. Well, he did kind of smoke screen it up a little bit by also going to Florida. Remember that? He went to Florida, and he said that he was going to Florida and Texas to inspect military installations. He was going to have motorcades and speeches in 5 different cities in each state. And we told you that he went to Florida, and he did some things there, gave some speeches, etc. I don't think we have to go through that. But he actually came back from Florida to Washington, D.C. before he went to Texas. And he pardoned the Thanksgiving turkey. And he and his wife entertained Supreme Court justices and their wives on Wednesday, the 20th of November. Well, then we talked about the Texas agenda. This is kind of where we left off. And we said after it was announced that President Kennedy would travel to Texas, remember his aides urged him not to go to the city of Dallas. You know, he thought, you know, that's okay, let's go to Texas, but let's not go to Dallas because they're so outspoken against the president. And we gave you, there's 3 reasons why. And we went through the one about the right-wing extremists that made a major scene with Adlai Stevenson on UN Day on October 24th of '63. 2,000 people there, 100 right-wing extremists. They coughed in cadence. They walked in the aisles carrying flags upside down. They yelled and shouted. They just totally disrupted the entire thing to the point where Stevenson had to state, "Surely, my dear friends, I don't have to come here from Illinois to teach Texas manners, do I?" And then as he walked out, he was spat upon, and one of the protesters actually hit him over the head with their protest signs. So that was the one reason why. Now, we're going to move on to the second reason, but before I do that, Sarah Schroepel texted me this morning, and she went to her English class, and the English professor's last name was Connally, and so she was talking to him. It turns out that her English professor at Riverton is the nephew of John Connally, the guy we're talking about here in that's going to be involved in this assassination. So it was kind of weird. Sarah had quite a talk with him today. He said that his wife still has the dress that she was going to wear in Austin, Texas, when the president gave a speech there that night before his assassination. So that was kind of interesting. I wonder, we'll have to get in touch with him maybe and see what he has to say later down. Okay, let's give you the second reason why Kennedy's aides urged him not to go to the city of Dallas. And it was because they considered Dallas ground zero for the far right in Texas. They considered Dallas ground zero for the far right in Texas. What do I mean by that? Dallas was considered ground zero for the right in Texas. Mary, we'll get back to you. What do you think I mean by that? Why? The aides said that Dallas was, quote, ground zero for the far right in Texas.
The most conservative place in Texas?
Close. The place where absolutely the biggest majority of right-wing extremists were located. And if you kind of go back to what they did to Adlai Stevenson at UN Day, he didn't want anything, the aides didn't want anything to do with going to Dallas. There's more right-wingers in Dallas than anywhere else. So I'm going to give you some examples of a couple of people that they were concerned about. The first was a guy by the name of Robert Welch, who's on your ID sheet. And he was the founder of a society called the John Birch Society. Has anybody heard of that? The John Birch Society? Well, the John Birchers are kind of a semi-religion, semi-philosophy that's about as far right as you can get. And it was very big in Dallas. The John Birch Society, it's spelled. The John Birch Society was real big in Dallas, and the founder of that, Robert Welch, was also right there. So there's John Birch societies all over the country, and they're radical, far-right extremists is what they are. They have a different view on government. But it just so happened that the John Birch Society was ground zero in Texas. That's where they originated. That's where their roots were. And the founder of it, Robert Welch, was right in Dallas as well. He was very highly visible. And to give you an idea how right-wing he was, he once branded President Eisenhower a dedicated, conscientious agent of the communist conspiracy. That's how he viewed Dwight Eisenhower, who I'm going to tell you is about as anti-communist as any man on earth, really. But Robert Welch called him a dedicated, conscientious agent of the communist conspiracy. He basically called President Eisenhower a communist. That's how far right this guy was. Now, Welch had a very serious supporter in Dallas, and this will be a very important name that we'll get to later. And I'm telling you, this name I'm going to give you next, in my opinion, you'll understand it at the end, is the key to the Kennedy assassination and non-conspiracy. Okay, and we'll get to this person later, but this is a key name, keep in mind. One of Welch's biggest supporters was a retired Major General. His name was Edwin Walker. So one of Welch's biggest supporters was a former or a retired Major General in the Army by the name of Edwin Walker. And he was a well-known right-wing extremist and very anti-communist. I mean, he was on the way far right of this thing. So Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, was highly visible in Dallas. He basically branded President Eisenhower a communist, which is really kind of tough to believe. And he had a very serious supporter, a retired Major General by the name of Edwin Walker, who was a well-known right-wing extremist, very anti-communist. Now, I'll tell you, just a few months before Kennedy came to Texas, somebody actually tried to shoot Walker. Somebody actually tried to shoot him. What happened, he was sitting in his house on Turtle Creek Boulevard in Dallas, and somebody came down the alley, and while he was sitting in the window working on some things, actually tried to shoot and assassinate him. And if you remember the old, maybe if you've ever seen old windows in houses, they're plastic now, but they have these dividers like this here, wood dividers. And basically Walker's head was in the window, and when he shot at him, the bullet hit the piece of wood and ricocheted off up and hit the ceiling, and plaster actually came onto the guy's head. So this guy was so right-wing that actually somebody tried to kill him months before the president even got there. And that's a key thing to remember, because we're going to get back to that. Okay? Actually, this happened months before Kennedy came, and the shooter escaped. And at this point in history, during the president's upcoming visit, that crime had still not been solved. Nobody knew who tried to take a shot and kill Edwin Walker. Okay? So that was the second reason why Kennedy's aides did not want him to come to Dallas, is because of the John Birch Society existence there, the fact that their leader was there, the fact that General Edward Walker was there. Just bad news. It was really a right-wing conservative group. And what is Kennedy considered? Again, a bit liberal. Okay. The third reason why his aides did not want him to go to Dallas is because the people of Dallas were too outspoken against his policies. The people of Dallas were too outspoken against his policies. Okay? The people of Dallas were too outspoken against his policies. The people of Dallas were too outspoken against his policies. I'm going to give you a couple examples of that. I'm handing one out right now. Okay? People of Dallas were too outspoken against his policies. Now, to give you an example of that, Kennedy is going to have a parade route through Dallas, right? We talked about 5 cities, 5 parade routes, 5 speeches. This handbill that I gave you was actually being distributed by agitators along the parade route, and many of these were left in the street after the parade route went by. And you can kind of see, if you want to go through it, wanted for treason. It's got a picture of the president with a front view and a side view, and it lists all the reason why he's treasonous and the treasonous activities that he committed supposedly as president against the United States. These were handed out during the parade route when he was coming through downtown Dallas, and many were found on the streets. You can't find any now. I'll tell you, if you could find one of these, original one of these, thousands of dollars if you could find them. But these were examples of how people were so outspoken against his policies. The next thing that happened is someone took a great big ad out in the Dallas Morning News the morning of Friday, November 22nd, 1963. And these are examples. Obviously, these didn't happen before the decision was made to go to Dallas, but it was an example of how the people of Dallas were outspoken against his policies. These are things that happened that his aides could have predicted would have happened, and did happen, and were wishing he didn't go to Dallas because of it. Okay? This is a big black border ad that appeared in the Dallas Morning News the morning the president arrived. Okay, and we'll tell you the story on this because it's kind of an interesting story. But what this is, this other handout I gave you, if there's extras, just stick them back on the table. But this was a black border ad that appeared in the Dallas Morning News. And I want you to keep this and come back to it. And just basically says, "Welcome Mr. Kennedy to Dallas." And it's very critical. And if you look down at the bottom, it was put in the paper by the American Fact-Finding Committee, an unaffiliated and nonpartisan group of citizens who wish the truth. And the chairman was Bernard Wiseman. And Bernard Wiseman's going to come up in our talk again. Now, if you look up there at the back of the classroom, these are worth a lot of money too, if you can find one of these. I actually have one of these framed in the red frame right kind of above where I sit. That came an ad right out of the paper. And these are examples of why the people of Dallas were too outspoken against his policies. And I kind of want to reiterate what I'm saying here is these came out the day of the motorcade after the president made the decision to go to Dallas anyway. But they're examples of why his aides said, man, people are too outspoken against your policies, let's not go there. Because they're really concerned that the trip to Dallas is going to be negative, right? They don't want the president being treated poorly like Adlai Stevenson was treated when he was there. So they said, let's just skip Dallas altogether. Come on, Mr. President. Well, Kennedy listened, and he listened carefully and politely, but after he had heard the say of his staff and advisors, he simply agreed to disagree. And he believed that he could not go to the state of Texas and skip the city's second largest, or skip the state's second largest city. He just disagreed with them. He said, no, we cannot do that. His job approval rating had dropped from 76% to 59% since his election. A lot of the job issues were in Texas, some were in Dallas, and he just didn't want to do that. Now let me ask this question, see if you're thinkers. Why would the job approval drop? Why all of a sudden would he drop that many points in job approval? I'll give you this much hint. The South is the one that's causing the drop of job approval. When you do a president's popularity and job approval, they pull people from all over, but there's a certain area that was killing him on job approval. What kind of a job he was doing, not getting people jobs, but what kind of a job is the president doing? With his job approval dropped from 76 to 59 because of a certain area that was upsetting. Which area was that? Very good. The South dropped down his job approval because the South was still mad about his support of civil rights. Very good. So he felt like he better get down to the South, and he better get into Dallas, and he better get some of these things tied up because his job approval had dropped, 15% or what is it, 17% from the time he was elected, and most of it was coming from people that didn't like what he was doing in the South because of his support of civil rights. So Kennedy listened, and he listened, and he listened, but he decided, listen, I got to go down there. Okay, I got to fix this mess between Connally. I got to fix this mess between Johnson and Yarborough, and we got to get into Texas. Well, let's not go to Dallas, Mr. President, because people are too outspoken against your policies. You got too many right-wingers down there. Look what they did to Ambassador Stevenson when he was down there. We don't want you to have the same treatment in Dallas. He said, I cannot go to Texas and miss the city or the state's second largest city. Got to go. Got to get some approval right now. Now, who was he afraid of in 64? Who did he think was going to beat him in an election in 64? He saw the election of 64 as an election he might lose. Not often does a sitting president lose re-election. Anybody know the last one that did? Who was the last president in our country that lost a re-election? George H. Bush, right? Lost to Clinton. That's like getting slapped in the face, kicked in the back. I mean, it's a bad, that's embarrassing when an incumbent president does not get his second term on re-election. Doesn't happen very often. Kennedy was nervous. Who was he nervous that he was going to have to run against in the presidency? Nelson. He felt if Nelson Rockefeller got the Republican nomination, or George Romney, Michigan senator, who was his son, Mitt Romney, he was afraid of those two guys. He was very much afraid of Rockefeller and not Mitt Romney, but his father, George. And he felt, man, if these guys get elected and get the nomination, I'm in trouble. Who was he not afraid of?
Nixon.
Barry Goldwater. Was not afraid of Barry Goldwater. Those were the three guys that were going to run, and we'll talk about Goldwater. He probably wasn't afraid of Nixon either, to tell you the truth. But Nixon was mad because he lost the election in 1960. He went into hiding. He decided to run in 68. So the president...
He was not afraid of who?
He was not afraid of Barry Goldwater, who was a senator from Arizona. He was thinking if Barry Goldwater ran, it would be no problem. He wouldn't even have to campaign. But he didn't think that was the case. He thought that it would be possible that Rockefeller would jump into the race or George Romney. The fact is, after Kennedy was assassinated and Lyndon Johnson served the rest of Kennedy's term and then ran for his own election, he defeated badly Barry Goldwater. So Kennedy wasn't afraid of him. So he felt that a good appearance in Dallas was crucial to the upcoming re-election effort. And so as a result of all this talk, a 3-hour visit was scheduled to Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. So Kennedy got together with his aides, told them we're going to Dallas, and this was the schedule for President Kennedy in Dallas. This was his schedule for November 22nd, 1963. It consists of 5 things. You really need to know this. So this was President Kennedy's schedule for November 22nd, 1963. This was what he was supposed to do that day. And you're going to get to see it all except the last part of it here. First of all, and this happened, he was going to give a breakfast speech at the Chamber of Commerce in Fort Worth, Texas. He was going to give a breakfast speech for the Chamber of Commerce in Fort Worth, Texas. So he's going to fly into Fort Worth, and he actually flew in there the night of the 21st, stayed overnight, and was scheduled to give a breakfast speech the morning of the 22nd in Fort Worth. After his breakfast speech at the Chamber of Commerce in Fort Worth the morning of November 22nd, he was going to take a short flight to Dallas and take a motorcade trip through downtown Dallas. So after he gave his breakfast speech in Fort Worth, he was going to hop on Air Force One, take a short, less than 20-minute flight to Dallas, He was going to get out at Love Field, he was going to get in a motorcade, and they were going to take a motorcade from Love Field in Dallas all the way through downtown Dallas, which they did. So, breakfast speech at the Chamber of Commerce in Fort Worth, then a short flight to Dallas, followed by a motorcade trip through downtown Dallas. Once he got all the way through Dallas, and kids, I got to tell you, he was 150 yards from being done with that motorcade before he was assassinated. He had went through an 11-mile route, and he was 100 yards from getting on the Stebbins Freeway and heading to the third thing he was supposed to do. He was going to give a luncheon speech at the Trade Mart in Dallas. Trade Mart is just like this, Trade Mart. Okay, after his trip through downtown Dallas, he was scheduled to give a luncheon speech at the Trade Mart in Dallas. So about 2,500 luncheon guests, Democratic supporters, were going to be at the Trade Mart in Dallas, where he's going to give a luncheon speech. Now you could compare the Trade Mart in a way to the Casper Event Center or the Rimrock Auto Center in Billings. It's an event center. That's what it is in Dallas. It's just a big building, okay? And he was going to give his speech at the Trade Mart. So he was going to get up the morning of the 22nd. He was going to give a breakfast speech at the Chamber of Commerce in Fort Worth, take a short flight to Dallas, where he would get on a motorcade and go on an 11-mile route through Dallas. Once he went through that 11-mile route through downtown Dallas, he was then going to go to the Trade Mart, where he was going to give a luncheon speech to about 2,500 guests. After that, they were going to fly to Austin, Texas, where he was going to give a speech at a $100 a plate dinner in Austin that night. So after his luncheon speech at the Trade Mart in Dallas, in front of about 2,500 guests, he was then going to take a short flight to Austin, Texas, where he was going to give another speech at a $100 a plate dinner there, fundraiser for the Democratic Party. So after his scheduled luncheon speech at the Trade Mart, he was then going to fly to Austin,